All right, moving on. Now we're going to talk a little bit of John Locke. First off, as you'll recall from either class before the world stopped or the previous video, remember Hobbes's version of the state of nature was one in which everybody was completely selfish, would steal your stuff, murder you at the drop of a hat if they thought it was to their own benefit. And so the only way out was to institute an incredibly powerful government who was in charge of literally everything. Locke starts from a different place. He thinks that people are basically good. That in general, he actually thinks that the laws of morality, that is the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, is a law that everybody is born knowing just by nature. Human nature, or if you don't like human nature, then it's written in the world around you, and everyone just has this innate sense of goodness. It does not mean that we're all perfect angels, but that people are generally basically good, and they want to get along. And frankly, in nature, there's relative abundance. Like, we all have enough to eat. We can find shelter in a cave if we need to, but we understand that if we were able to get together and cooperate, we could do better. Because let's face it, if you spend all your time out hunting deer, yeah, you might have a lot of nice steak to eat, but you won't have very many oranges. You got to come to me as the guy who picks all the oranges, and we're going to have to do a little bartering. And the reality is that we could all do a lot better. We could invent things like air conditioning and Xboxes and stuff like that. If everybody did the thing, we all kind of worked together. Doesn't mean we have to share everything, but we understand that if we were able to make agreements, social contracts, come to deals, then we could all do better. So remember this, the difference between Locke and Hobbes so far is that Hobbes thinks that the state of nature is hell on earth because everybody's only interested in themselves. Locke thinks that people are basically good, but they do understand that if they organized and got together, that they could all do better. So you can imagine, for Hobbes, it was really important that the Leviathan had all power because everybody was so murderous and evil all the time. You had to have something with extraordinary, extreme, ultimate power to be able to stop people from doing all these horribly selfish, murderous things that they would always do and have a society of any kind. Well, for Locke, nature provided, it was fine, but we could do better. So what kind of agreement would people come to in a situation like that? Locke thinks it would have to be one where everybody, if I'm going to agree to whatever this contract is, to setting up this government, then it's going to have to be one that represents my interests. But I understand that I don't get to go around just telling everybody what to do, because I want you to join the agreement too, and you have your own interests. So what are we going to do when you and I disagree? Well, we'll put it to a vote. Everybody who's agreed to leave the state of nature, become part of this organized society, the way we'll make decisions is that we'll vote on them. So everybody has a say. Everybody's interests are represented. Even if we don't always follow what you want to do, your voice was heard. And if you hate the state of the government, if you hate everything we're doing when we get together, if we're always voting against you, you can leave. You just go back to the state of nature. You can't come crying to us. When the wolves steal your food or you get attacked or whatever, that's your problem. But you can leave if you prefer the way things were in the relative abundance, but not as great as it could be world of the state of nature. You're always free to leave society. If you don't leave, if you stick around, well, then you've given your acceptance to the rules. That's called tacit consent. You haven't actually signed the agreement because you never did this. No one ever came to you and said, here's a social contract, we'll just sign right here, make sure you agree to all our rules about democracy and all that. But you were born into this society, you have benefited from from its advantages, and by staying here, you have given your approval to be ruled by the government. Or you can go to the state of nature if you want. Good luck, you can find that. So that is Locke's version of the social contract. And you can see maybe why, or how he started with a very different starting point in terms of what human nature looked like, and therefore what the state of nature looked like. And so even though it's the same basic idea that, self-interested actors come together in a neutral situation, what kind of agreement would they come to? Well, given their different starting points, Hobbes and Locke come to very different places. Hobbes comes to the place of the Leviathan that has to control everything. Locke comes to the place of democracy, where everyone's interests are at least heard. this is not a super surprising idea to you, but you live in America. At the time that this was first postulated, it was outrageous. The idea that regular people should have a say in how they were governed was an entirely new idea, right? Up until then, it was always, hey, divine right, God smiled on the king and the king's lineage. They're the ones in charge. They are fit to rule you. And in fact, for those of you who've done a little reading in Plato's Republic, that's basically what he says. Some people are born rulers, some people are born to be led. So the idea of self-governance, of democracy as a legitimate form of government was frankly kind of laughable. It was an entirely new idea. You can see that it took root and it's had a lot of great successes over the years, but at the time, it was absolutely revolutionary. That's Locke's social contract. Important to know him as you go forward and you talk about, say, you take a poli-sci class or whatever, but just that distinction between Hobbes and Locke is a really important one. Moving on to our major focus this semester about the epistemology and metaphysics. You will recall that epistemology is the study of knowledge, how we can come to know things, and we can thank Locke for a lot of that. And there's going to be a little bit of metaphysics stuff thrown in. Frankly, it just wasn't the kind of thing that he was all that interested in. He did have some things to say about it, but it was mostly tangential as it related to his epistemology. Locke is an empiricist. Empiricism is the idea that knowledge comes from your sense experience. That's it, right? Something is empirical if it is something that can be sensed. And so Locke says all knowledge ultimately is based on your senses. So let's see what we got here. Knowledge is possible, and at rock bottom, all knowledge is based on sense experience. He says that there are these two aspects of a mental life. It actually kind of all starts for Locke with what are ideas? Where do they come from? We know that we have ideas, and there's lots of metaphysical problems in trying to describe what an idea is. It doesn't actually have physical mass and all that other stuff. But we do have ideas. Where do we get them? This is the classic nature versus nurture. Are we born with ideas, which, by the way, Socrates thought? Are we born with certain knowledge, or do we get it from our experience? Classic nature versus nurture. And in that argument, in the nature versus nurture argument, Locke, 100% ironclad, nurture all the way. All the way. The mind at birth, he says, is a blank slate. Blank, to be written on by experience. Blank slate, so important is this idea that we often refer to it by its Latin name, the Tabula Rasa. That's what that is. Tabula is like a tablet, rasa, empty. So, the mind at birth is a blank slate. Yes, you should know tabula rasa, to be written on by experience. So you can think of it kind of like a whiteboard, right? The mind at birth is a blank whiteboard. And your sense experience, when I say experience with John Locke, always referring to your sense experience, information you get from your eyes or whatever, sight, hearing, taste, feeling, and smelling. Those are the ways you have to interact with the world. That is where you get your information. So if you want to talk about, oh, I experienced, I don't know, love or something, that's fine, but you're going to have to trace that back to some sense experience for Locke. All knowledge, the mind at birth is a blank slate to be written on by your sense experience. And as you do that, the activities of the mind, you may have an experience, And then you may think about that experience. So this is how we can come up with things like, we might say, well, G-Locke, if every idea has to be based on an experience, then where do I get the idea of unicorns? Because I've never experienced a unicorn, right? And I think the answer is pretty obvious. We have the experience of these different things, say horse, say pointy, horn. I don't know what else you need to include there for a unicorn, but we can take those different ideas and combine them in this mental activity called reflection. So we have experience, which is like the first order thing that happens. It's the world impressing itself upon us. The world is sort of like pounding itself into us, so to speak. Or in terms of the blank slate, it's being written on. And frankly, Locke's idea was not just like written on with a marker that you can come by and erase. I mean, that makes some sense. Sometimes you forget things. But it's really more like when you have an experience, it sort of gets etched into it. So some experiences are really intense, and it gets etched really hard. And of course, that colors, so to speak, how you have other experiences. You bring that to the table. Over time, as your tabula rasa is less and less rasa, as you fill up more and more experiences, those become part of the tabula, right? They become part of your mind, that the new experiences flow through. And so they affect how you have new experiences, how you think about the things you experience. So, experience is the world happening to you. There's a strong sense in which you don't really have a choice in it. Whereas in reflection, well, that's where we can create things like mermaids and unicorns, right? By combining different ideas that we do have. So, and even like a memory would be reflection. Remember, experience is the world acting upon you. If it's anything other than a sense experience, it's reflection. I hope you're following me so far, because you're not here for me to look you in the eye and ask you. I'm just going to keep going. So far, this is our most important idea. The mind at birth is a blank slate to be written on by experience, and that makes John Locke the quintessential empiricist. An empiricist is a person who believes all knowledge is ultimately traceable to some sense experience. Okay? Really important, and it's a really big deal, and you can see with this tabula rasa to be written on by experience, how that makes him a good empiricist. What else we have there? Simple and complex ideas. This actually gets a little tricky. Let me see if I forgot anything important from my notes here. Just to say, I think it's the same idea, something I had written down here though, that sense experience provides the raw data and the mind operates on it. So what the mind does with that raw data, that's reflection. The sense experience itself providing that raw data, that is, well, you might call it experience. Sense experience is the good empirical stuff. And let's think about this for a minute. Suppose you didn't have any senses. Suppose you couldn't see anything, or hear anything, or smell anything, or feel anything, or taste anything. And if you have ESP, you couldn't do that either. You couldn't do whatever your sixth sense is. You had no physical senses at all. What ideas could you have in that case? I mean, you're not going to have an idea of a puppy, right? You can't even, other people can't tell you about stuff if you can't hear them, so it's not like you can borrow from their experience. You can't feel cold or pain, or you can't taste, pineapples or whatever. What thoughts could you have? Remember Tommy, right, from The Who, deaf, dumb, and blind kid? He played a mean pinball. He's a little different because he still has a sense of smell, apparently, right? He played by sense of smell according to the song. But you're Tommy, deaf, dumb, and blind kid. You can't. It's a bad example because I guess he had sight before he saw some horrible thing that made him lose all his senses. But what would Tommy be able to think? What would you be able to think if you had no sense experience? This is an important thought experiment, and I encourage you to try it. You've got time. So just think about any idea that you have. If you strip away all of the sense experience from it, what's left? Right? Is there anything left to even have that idea? Some people have said math. You could theoretically, if you had no sense experience, you might still be able to do some like pure reason, pure abstract reasoning. Locke, of course, says, nah, because you wouldn't have the concept of quantity if you didn't see multiple things in the world. You know, like all the ideas, even the basic concepts of mathematics, according to Locke anyway, ultimately rely on you having had some sense experience. So I leave it to you to do that thought experiment some other time. I'm going to keep talking. We're moving on to the simple and complex ideas. And it's not just ideas. You can imagine a complex idea might be something like that unicorn, right? Where we take different ideas, combine them, boom, we have a complex idea. So it's even a little bit trickier than that. When it comes to sensations, that is sense experience, we sometimes aren't even clear about our simple and complex ideas in that case. I'll give you an example. Think about an ice cube. Imagine you're holding an ice cube. In fact, you're at home, go to the fridge and get an ice cube and hold it in your hand for this thought experiment. I'm not going to wait for you, you're going to have to hit pause. So here you are, holding the ice in your hand. And what do you feel? It's cold. It's hard. It's a little bit wet. Maybe it's got angles on it, it's pointy in some places. You with me on all that? Well, pointy isn't the same as cold. Cold isn't the same as hard. Wet isn't the same as any of those things. So really, if you want to be careful, like Locke does, if you want to be really careful in describing your experience, you might say, I feel coldness, I feel hardness, I feel pointiness or angularity, I feel moisture, something like that, right? So if we have these different sensations, cold, hard, wet, angular, where do we get this idea that it's one ice cube? Because none of those sensations did the trick, right? Each of those sensations was different from each other. Since they were different from each other, and yet we say one ice cube, it's not the sensations that give us that idea. That's a mental act. That's something we do. We take those simple sensations. Simple just means only one, individual, distinguishable from everything else. Hardness, coldness, those are simple sensations, okay? Or in this case, you can call them simple ideas because they're ideas in the sense that when we have the sensation, it's activating our mind. But they're all distinguishable from one another. We combine them in a mental act. We combine them into a single object and say, ice cube. It is one thing. I am feeling the ice cube. Not really. You're feeling coldness. You're feeling moisture. You're feeling hardness, right? That's what you're feeling. And this is a little bit tricky for us to do because we think, yeah, but I'm looking at it. Yeah, I can even see it. It's cloudy, whatever your ice cube looks like. The point, though, is if you're really careful about explaining what your sensations are, the idea of a single ice cube, it's not that it's not true. It's just that it's a mental act that we do in combining those simple sensations into a single object. It's a big deal, right? So, you have to keep this in mind. A simple idea is one that is totally distinguishable from all others, right? A complex idea is a combination of simple ideas. It could be a combination of complex ideas, but whatever, it's a combination of ideas. Really important because even something like we would say, well, my simple sensation is I'm feeling an ice cube. Not really. That's actually a complex idea, right? Because it's made up of us combining hardness, coldness, wetness, angularity. Pretty wild stuff, I think. So, even sometimes when we think we're talking about an experience, like I'm holding the ice cube, it's really something that we're doing in reflection. It's a mental act that's putting those simple sensations together. I'm going through this kind of quickly. I'm sure you have questions or concerns or thoughts are coming to mind. I strongly encourage you to get onto our website and check out those like the MIT resources and the Stanford Encyclopedia. Really good stuff. John Locke, Tabula Rasa, primary, secondary. Oh, we're not there yet. Primary, secondary qualities. We'll talk about that in a second. Simple, complex ideas. All these. You can certainly find information that's reliable from any of those resources that I put up in Blackboard if you want to read more about it. And I encourage you to because our time is limited and I'm already at almost 20 minutes, and I still got one more thing to go. And this is really just sort of a scattershot overview to let you know what it is, well, what it is you're responsible for. So back to this idea about the ice cube, for example, right? Coldness, hardness, the square. It may be one experience, but it's made up of a combination of lots of simple experiences, right? Simple sensations. So now I ask you this question, because Locke asked this question. He said, suppose a man, or a person, he said man, suppose a man is blind from birth, right? And throughout his life, he has a cube over here, and he has a ball over here, and he knows that ball is round and cube is square, or, you know, ball doesn't have corners, but cube does have corners. I mean, he can distinguish them perfectly, right? He's been blind his whole life. Every time he picks one up, he's like, ah, cube. So he knows what he's doing, right? Suppose that person were later in life given sight. Would that person, on the basis of what they see only, would that person be able to distinguish the cube from the ball? Okay? Remember, person's perfectly good at it in a tactile sense, has done so their whole life, right? Now they're able to see before they see it and touch it, right? Just by looking, could that person tell which was which? What do you think Locke's answer was, given what we've said so far? I'll just tell you. Locke's answer was no, that person could not figure it out, because the idea of, when you and I think of a ball, it being round and sort of imagining it, that's because we're accustomed to combining what we see with what we feel, right? We see it and feel it at the same time. And so in our mind, it's one thing. And so in our mind, we say, well, of course, maybe, we say, of course the person can tell, because you can tell just by looking that that's the one that feels like it has a corner. That one doesn't look like it even has any corners. Well, Locke said, if a person didn't have sight, if they didn't have that kind of simple idea coming to them every time they touched it, then they wouldn't make that connection necessarily, right? They wouldn't know to, because they had never combined those in their mind before. What do you think? You think he's right about that? I can tell you this. In 1996, it happened. There was a guy who had been blind since birth, and the cause of his blindness had been misdiagnosed, and it was now possible to give him sight. And they did, and they ran this experiment. What do you think happened? I'll tell you in a minute. First, I want to get through this primary and secondary qualities of object stuff. Or you can hit pause and go talk about it with your friends, you know, from safe social distance and all that stuff. See what they think. See what they think the answer would be. Could a person blind from birth, who's perfectly able to distinguish a cube and a ball, if they were given sight, could they, on the basis of vision, distinguish the cube from the ball? Locke says no. We have an experiment that actually will give us some evidence, and I'll tell you about that in a second, but that's the question. Primary and secondary qualities of objects. Now you'll notice that when you got to keep these straight, okay? Simple and complex are properties of ideas, or even sensations. Okay, a sensation is always going to be simple. Technically, when we combine them, it's an idea, minimally. But primary and secondary qualities are not of ideas, they're of objects. So this is as close as we're going to get to Locke's metaphysics here. He says, objects in the world, which there must be objects in the world, for Locke. If you're going to be an empiricist, and you believe that all knowledge is based on sense experience, well then you had better believe that there is a world out there for which you to experience, right? It'd be a little weird to say all knowledge is based on your senses, and your senses don't really exist, or they're totally unreliable. That'd be an odd epistemology. So objects do in fact exist. A primary quality of an object is any quality an object has, regardless of it being sensed. And so when it comes to physical objects, a physical object must take up space, right? Oh, if it takes up no space, it's not physical. How much space it takes up, we may not know, but if it's going to be a physical object, it must take up space. So he says that this property of an object he calls extension? Like how extended into space is it? And of course, for an object to exist, it can't just exist instantaneously and then disappear. That's not really existence, so it must endure. So extension, duration, how long something is there, how many of something there are. I'm actually up in a classroom at BCTC right now. You're not here, so you may not know this, but there's actually quite a few tables in here. It looks like 6 times 3 times 3 is 36. There's 36 tables in here. So amount or number. These are things that are true about objects, whether there's anyone here to sense them or not. I don't know, a tree falls in the forest, no one hears it, doesn't make a sound, I don't know. But it fell. That's what Locke would say, right? That there is a tree. There's one in that case, that would be the amount of them. So there are certain things that it doesn't really matter whether or not you're there to sense them, or whether you could sense them, or whatever. They are true of objects in themselves. True in itself. Secondary qualities or properties of objects, Locke tells us, aren't really properties of objects at all. So it's a little weird to say that there are primary and secondary qualities of objects, but secondary qualities of objects aren't actually qualities of objects, but that's what he says. Instead, a secondary quality is kind of a shorthand way of talking about an object's ability to produce a sensation in us. So, a secondary quality, you might say it's a capacity or a power. Those are both fine words. It's the ability to produce a sensation in us. Let's see, secondary qualities are capacity, so things like color, temperature, volume, right? Things that we can sense. To say that an object is yellow is to say that it has the power to produce a sensation of yellowness within me, something like that. Temperature, whether something is hot or cold is not really a property of the object. It is relative, and if you don't believe me, here's another great experiment for you to do. If you got like little kids, this is a good one to do with them, except don't burn anybody. If you take one hand and stick it in icy cold water, and then you stick it into a bucket of room temperature water, the water feels warm, right? Because your hand is cold. You follow me so far? This is not rocket science. Yeah. So whether that water is hot or cold isn't really a property of the water. It's a property of how it affects you. So if you get your hand really cold by sticking it in the ice water, then you stick it in the room temperature water, that water feels warm. If you take some really warm water, this is where you don't want to burn anybody, you take some really warm water and stick your hand in there, and then you stick it in that room temperature water, it's going to feel cold, because the water is colder than your hand, right? So if you do both, you put one hand in ice cold water, one hand in really hot water, and stick them both in the same bucket of water, you're going to have a sensation. It's hot over here, it's cold over here. So hot and cold isn't really a property of the water. It's a property of how the water affects me, right? We could do the same with color. Locke didn't have a bunch of modern science at his disposal, so it gets a little dicey. But that color is just a certain wavelength of light. When you see my beautiful red shirt, what's happening is all this light is bombarding it and bouncing off it. The shirt, the properties of the shirt absorb certain wavelengths of light and reflect the others, reflects the red ones, okay? So you say red shirt, really it's red waves, or let's say wavelengths within a certain range of frequency hitting my eye. That's what redness is, right? It's a sensation in me. So to say that an object is red is really just it's not really true. It's a shorthand way of saying it produces a sensation of redness within me, you know? Or you might prefer, it means that the object has qualities such that it is absorbing all other wavelengths of light and reflecting only the red part of the spectrum. So, things like, this makes sense. Things you can see like color, things you can feel like temperature, things you can hear like volume. Anytime it relates to a sense, like if it's a stink, right, then that would also be a secondary quality. Secondary qualities, not technically properties of the objects themselves, but it's a way of talking about the power an object has to produce a certain sensation in us, in we sensing creatures. If you're interested in reading about a particular shade of yellow, you should look up all of Ed Averill's papers. He was a teacher of mine back in the day, and he became famous for a particular wavelength of yellow that he just used as an example once, but it became sort of a standard example in modern philosophy. Yeah, sorry about that. Anything else I need to tell you about that? Well, we might ask one further question. Okay, hotshot, Brandon, John Locke, whoever. This then, because these are how we have sensations, it's through these that we know about primary qualities, extension, duration, number, and all that. So, what is it that we're sensing? If all of our knowledge comes through our senses, and senses are really just how we relate to these physical objects, what can we know about the objects themselves other than just how they produce sensation in us? Locke's answer to that is nothing. You really can't. Because everything, all knowledge is based on sense experience. You can't go beneath sense experience to get any further answers. That's the baseline for where all knowledge comes from. So what can we know about the world as it is in itself, apart just from how we experience it? Nothing. Can we even know that things do take up space? Well, just by way of inference. Because we have the sensation of the desk, we have to assume that there is something there causing that sensation. That's the best we can do for Locke. So I don't know what you want to say about that, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, a strong point or a weak point. That's up to you. But these are the ideas that you're responsible for. I'll run through them quickly again. Social contract is democracy because people are basically good, so we don't have to go the whole Leviathan route. Empiricism is the idea that all knowledge is based on sense experience. Locke is the #1 example of that. He and David Hume, who we're going to study here in a day or two. Simple and complex ideas. We often mistake complex ideas for simple ones because we're just not careful enough in describing them. Simple ideas are all that are perfectly distinguishable. Complex ideas are combined. Experience is what happens to us, the world impressing itself upon us, etching its way into that tabula rasa, if you will, and reflection is mental activity with it, remembering, postulating, combining different ideas, speculating, whatever it is, a mental activity based on those. Tabula rasa, of course, that blank slate that we're all born with, that's written on by experience, which is how we get all knowledge, and primary and secondary qualities of objects. Primary are the necessary ones like extension, duration, and number that objects have regardless of your ability to sense them, and secondary qualities are just a shorthand way of talking about an object's ability to produce a sensation in us. So those are kind of the big ideas. To answer the question that I posed before, back in 1996 when the blind guy was given sight and they presented him with the cube and the ball, based on visual cues alone, he was not able to distinguish which was which. Locke was right. So the idea that we should be able to just tell by looking that those are the pointy bits and the other one doesn't have those, so this is the one that's the cube and the other one is the ball. The person didn't have those prior experiences of feeling it and seeing it at the same time and was not able to make that combination. That doesn't mean Locke is right about everything, but it does probably mean that we need to think a little bit more about his analysis of simple and complex ideas. That's it for now. You've been with me for a long time. Sorry to take you away from your Judge Judy or whatever it is you do for an hour or for a half an hour in the middle of the day. Good luck. I hope you're staying well, and I will be back with another video sometime soon. Sorry. Bye.